So we are in week 2 of this series, and by the way, I don't know, where is our church? This is so weird. It's like the first day of summer break and Father's Day and all of that, and it's just like, whew. But the people who really love Jesus. And also, we have a Father's Day video, which Rebecca was not made aware of, and so we'll show that later. So I know you'll be just writhing in anticipation in your seats for that. We'll just surprise you later in the service. It's going to be epic. So, okay, we're in week 2 of this series called The 7 Signs. There are 7 miracles or signs in the Gospel of John, and he uses each sign to give us insight into the identity of Jesus. And so what we're doing is we're walking through each sign 1 week at a time. And we kicked this off last week by looking at the first sign, which is Jesus turning water into wine at a wedding in Cana. Today we're moving on to what John tells us is the second sign. And as I mentioned last week, at various times and places over the last 2,000 years, Christians will often stand for the reading of the Scriptures. And it's intended to be done out of reverence, to honor the sacredness and the significance of the words. Okay, and so what I'd like us to do is do that again today. Would you stand as we read John chapter 4, verses 43 to 54. We read about the second miracle. It says, after the 2 days he left for Galilee, talking about Jesus. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. Sorry, that didn't feel right to me, but am I starting in the same place as you guys are? Okay. This is weird. Thanks, Bob. I've always wanted to be a good reader. When I was in second grade, I wasn't a good reader. But through the power of Jesus, I'm getting better. So here we are in the sacred text, and I'm just fumbling through it. Okay. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they also had been there. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine, and there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Unless you people see signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. The royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. Go, Jesus replied, your son will live. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. So he and his whole household believed. This was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. Okay, you can be seated. Now, in a sense, this entire series is about miracles. And I think at some point along the way in our lives, we all want miracles. But here's the catch. Nobody wants to be in a situation that necessitates one. Because the prerequisite for a miracle is a problem. You don't really get one without the other. And the bigger the problem, the greater the potential for a miracle. Last week we saw that if the wedding party in Cana hadn't run out of wine, there would have been no reason for the winemaker to do what he did. What the bride and the groom perceived as a huge problem was really a perfect opportunity for God to display his glory. Now today we see a man in a desperate situation. And what he does with his desperation is what makes all the difference. His all-consuming problem becomes really the hinge point of his life. And so I want to walk together through this man's experience, and along the way, I want us to think about what this might mean for us. And so we're just going to kind of enter right into the story this morning. And the first thing that we see is this. He comes to the end of himself. We see this powerful, wealthy man in a place of absolute desperation. His son is on the verge of death. He's got a dangerously high fever, the kind of fever that killed people every day in their world. So I want you to put yourself in his position for a second. Like those of you that are parents, can you imagine for a second what he was going through? And I think about this and I go, I don't think I really can. Because I absolutely can't imagine losing one of my kids. We actually had a crazy scare a couple years ago with Kate. She was just finishing 8th grade. It was in June, and she was invited to play basketball with the high school team, with the varsity. And they were playing in this tournament with some really big girls. And Kate's a guard, so she's dribbling the ball up the court as fast as she can, trying to break the press. And she's going as fast as she can, and these two girls converge on her as fast as they can. And they collide. And one of the girls was just enormous, like 6'6", 240. Kidding. Okay, she was big. Just seeing if you're awake. She was not that big. That's like Bobby Wagner and Kate colliding. It's like, but there were the three girls and two from the other team that were closing in, and Kate, and everybody was going full speed. And after the collision, everybody else got up. The other two got up, and Kate just laid there. Now, the girl that came really flying in, really legitimately was like 6'1", really big girl, and she came in with knees flying in, and she kneed Kate right in the thigh. Now, on the way home, Kate was in like crazy pain. Like moving her legs, like we could hardly even get her in the car because we couldn't like bend her leg to get her in the seat and all of that. She's just screaming. And Jen and I were looking at each other going, this is weird. This is worse than any kind of Charlie horse that we've ever seen. And so we took her to the ER just to make sure nothing was broken. So they did the x-ray, and the doctor came in and talked to us, and she said, there's no fracture, so that's good, but we're seeing something else on here that's really a pretty big concern. And so you should schedule her for an MRI at Children's Hospital immediately, because this was Friday. You should do that immediately. Get in there on Monday. And the doctor sort of had this serious tone to what she was saying, but she would not be very specific about what she saw in the x-ray. Kate's sitting right there, and so she's just kind of talking around this thing, and she just kept saying, there's an abnormality that's unrelated to the injury that deserves a better look. Now, I know, after some years of medical experience, they don't just schedule MRIs for no reason. And they're expensive. Usually takes a long time to get one. And this was Friday night, and they wanted us getting one on Monday. So Monday morning at like 7 o'clock in the morning, we got a call from her family doctor. And over the weekend, the ER medical team had sent over the x-ray and the report to her family doctor. And so they let us know first thing in the morning that they were already calling Children's on our behalf to schedule an MRI. And that the earliest, they had already talked to him, the earliest we could possibly get in was going to be Tuesday morning. We're going to have to wait a whole day. So could we come in, though, and see the family doctor on Monday and let them take a look at her and all of that? So the nurse was talking with Jen about all this, and she happens to be somebody that we know. And before she hung up, she said, oh man, like, how are you guys doing? She said, I saw the report, and I just couldn't believe it was Kate. And so I just want you to know, we're going to do everything that we can to get you the best care available. She said, I'm so sorry. Are you guys okay? And so everyone's talking like this, but no one's telling us what's going on. And Jenna and I were like, what is happening? What is going on here? So we took Kate into the family doctor later that morning, and she looked at the x-ray, and she read the report, and she was super vague about what was happening. And again, Kate's in the room. She's being super vague. And so Jen and I looked at each other like, hey, Kate, why don't you go get, something from the car? And then we looked at the doctor and we said, listen, what's happening? What's going on here? Why is everybody acting so serious? And she said, well, it could turn out to be nothing, but it really looks like she has a bone tumor. And so I said, okay, well, hopefully it's nothing. And Jen and I have been talking about it over the weekend. We're like, apparently something serious. But we said, if it is a tumor, then what? And she said, well, they're going to want to admit Kate right away and do surgery, and then they will probably move right into radiation and chemo, like right away. And so Jen and I, we nodded and we smiled and we tried, we're pretty relaxed. And she's like, wow, you guys seem like you're doing really well with this. And we told her, hey, we talked about this over the weekend, and we decided we're just going to assume it's nothing until we're absolutely sure that it isn't. Because worrying and starting to think about worst case scenarios doesn't do anybody any good. And really, Kate doesn't need to know that anything is happening here that's very serious, except that she needs an MRI. So we don't want her to see us panicking. We're doing everything we can to just play it cool. So that Tuesday, we got the MRI. They scheduled our follow-up to discuss it on Wednesday, which again is really quick if you know how this stuff works. And they scheduled the follow-up with an orthopedic surgeon. This is who was going to review the MRI results with us. And so everything was happening so fast, and we were being rushed right through this, and it was all top priority, which was really nice, but at the same time, it was just scaring us to death. Now, like I said, we decided to not think about worst case scenario, and we did a pretty darn good job of it, really. It was there, but we just sort of tried to put it out of our minds, and we didn't talk about it. But we felt like we should let our family know what was happening. So Jen called her parents, and I called my dad, and I remember being on the phone. I'll probably remember this forever, being on the phone with my dad, and I was explaining what would happen, and he was asking a lot of questions, and so I said, well, they'll probably do surgery right away, and then they'll start radiation and chemo, like this week, like a few days from now. And my dad was like, oh my. And I don't know if this happens to you, but for some reason, hearing a familiar voice, like when you're in a tough spot, and he just said those words, and something in me just like snapped, and reality just hit me, and I couldn't push it out of my mind anymore, and I was like, well, this is serious. Like, we could lose our little girl. And so it's like, man, this happens to families all the time. Kids get cancer, and sometimes they die. And suddenly, the weight of all of this just hit me, and I couldn't shake it. And so I got kind of choked up with him as I was finishing up the phone call. And then when we hung up, I wept. I mean, I had like this 10-minute breakdown, and then I sucked it back up again. I'm like, okay, we're good. Now, this was 2 years ago, and some of you realize Kate's been running around here for 2 years. And so obviously, it all turned out to be nothing. The ortho surgeon at Children's looked at the MRI with us, and then he said, you know what, this abnormality thing it's nothing. It's just a normal bone cyst. And he said, you can see that it's already starting to heal on its own. And I'm looking at the X-ray, the MRI, I'm going, oh yeah, obviously. He says, it's no problem. This is nothing, but the trauma, he said, to her leg from the collision, this is the worst hematoma I have ever seen. The tissue damage here is unreal. He said, I'm actually surprised that her femur didn't snap in half from the collision. He's like, but cancer? No. He's like, this is just a normal bone. So people get these, and it's going to go away on its own. It's already starting to go away. And he said, I'm so sorry that you guys had been thinking otherwise. And Kate's like, you've been thinking otherwise? Like, yes, we have. So, for us, crisis averted. But I will tell you, for me, for those 5 days, that was unreal. We were on the wildest of rides. Okay, now back to the man in our story. His son is lying in a bed with a deadly fever. And the medical people in the palace, they know this is not the kind of thing that people recover from. Now, he's a very powerful, very wealthy guy. He's a royal official. Scholars believe that he was probably a high-ranking official to King Herod. So this guy is resourced, and he's used to getting what he wants. But when it comes to the health of his son, he's helpless, and he has come to the end of himself. And I think that we have all been in that place at some point in our lives. And my guess is that it may be that some of you are in that place this morning. Like you got up this morning, and you got yourself here, and maybe you put on your best happy face. But underneath all of it, okay, underneath the surface, something is going on in your life, and it's a problem for you that is all-consuming, and you realize you're helpless to fix it. I mean, maybe you're here this morning and your marriage is a mess. Maybe you don't know, like, even where it went wrong. It hasn't always been this way. You know, if it had been always, you wouldn't have gotten married, right? But you're not connecting anymore. And there's a lot of tension a lot of the time, and you've tried everything you know, but you're at the end of yourself. Or maybe you're here and your struggle is with your faith. Like, you just find yourself with all kinds of doubts. You don't feel very solid about what you believe at all. Maybe at one point it felt solid, or maybe it never has for you, but you really don't know where to put your feet. Now, there are times when the Christian faith, when you think about it, just feels like a fairy tale. And you think to yourself, like, how in the world am I supposed to believe this? And maybe you go, I don't want to abandon my faith altogether. Like, atheism seems like so hollow and so empty to me. But the reality is you're really struggling with doubts. There are questions that you have. There are barriers. There are issues. And the truth is you feel helpless. You feel at the end of yourself. Or maybe it's something going on with your kids. Maybe you see them struggling with something in some way. I mean, maybe they're just toddlers. And you look and you go, man, they lack self-control. This kid lacks self-control. There's behavioral issues. It's like, what's happening? And it concerns you. Or maybe your kids are much older and they still lack self-control. And you're just watching them struggle. And it's tearing you up. Or maybe somebody you care about is suffering in some way. And you want to help. And you want to do something. But you don't know what to do. You don't know what to say. Okay, or maybe you got issues in your family. Maybe things are just kind of a mess. They've been that way for a long time. You look around and there's just anger and there's hurt everywhere. There's just brokenness and all this dysfunction. Adults are acting like children and you can't fix it. Or maybe you got financial issues. You look at your bills and then you look at your income and you do the calculations and you go, there's no way this is going to work. And the stress of it is just crushing you. Okay, I don't know what it could be. It could be any number of things, but you have come to a place where you are at the end of yourself. There are times when this is the experience for all of us. We're facing something so overwhelming, and we know we don't have the capacity to fix it. And in and of ourselves, we're powerless. Well, this man, okay, just to get a picture of this, he finds himself in this situation. The son that he loves is on the verge of death, and all of the resources he has at his disposal have fallen short. He's broken, he's helpless, he's desperate, and he has come to the end of himself. So he does the only thing that he can possibly think of to do. And that leads us to the second thing. He pursues Jesus relentlessly. Now, this is pretty amazing, really, for several reasons. There were all kinds of reasons for him to not pursue Jesus. For one thing, you think about it, he had to leave his son to go and do it. He goes on this, you think about it, if your son were dying and laying in a bed, would you want to leave and risk him dying without you there? I mean, I don't know. If this was Cameron, the idea of leaving and not being there with him would have been torturous for me. I think I'd want to be with him to the end if that's what we were coming to. But this dad is refusing to give up hope that there might be a way. So he goes on this long journey to Jesus, to find Jesus. Now, his son, we're told, is in Capernaum. He's in Capernaum. Jesus is in Cana. And this, folks, is a 20-mile distance. And it's uphill. Cana is way up high, and Capernaum is way down low by the lake. About a 20-mile journey. It's a 40-mile round-trip journey. That's a long way on foot or on a horse. And it's also interesting that this is really toward the front end of Jesus' ministry. There's a whole lot with Jesus that hasn't happened yet. Jesus turned water into wine in Cana, and there's like a buzz about that, but John refers to this as being the second sign. So what did this guy even have to go off of in the first place? Well, it's interesting because when we read John's gospel a little more carefully, we see that this was in no way just the second miracle of Jesus. After turning water into wine at the wedding, Jesus did some other stuff, okay? We're told about it by John before we get to today's miracle. For one thing, it says he went to Jerusalem for Passover. And this is what John says in John chapter 2, verse 23. It says, "Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name." Okay, so according to John chapter 2, Jesus was performing all kinds of signs. Our story today is in John chapter 4. So whatever John is doing with these 7 signs, they aren't intended to be like a comprehensive list. John tells us that this was Jesus' second sign, okay, and then he says, after coming from Judea to Galilee. Okay, but this wasn't literally his second miracle. What John describes in his gospel, when you think about what he's doing as he talks about Jesus and describes what's going on, he's just given us a fraction of all that Jesus said and all that Jesus did. In fact, toward the very end of the book, John says this, and this is chapter 20. John says, "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And then these are the very last words of John's gospel. And I love that John is such a simple writer. I get the sense that he was just a really simple guy. But listen to this. He says, "Jesus did many other things as well," after writing the whole book of John. "If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room for all the books that would be written." So what we're getting, okay, by John's own admission in the Gospel of John, in the 7 signs, they're essentially like a Sports Center's top 10. I mean, these are the highlights. These are the top plays. And they're chosen in order to reveal to us the identity of Jesus, being the Messiah, being the Son of God. Now, I bring all this up because this man in Capernaum, even at this point in Jesus' ministry, has heard of Jesus. Jesus has been out there doing some stuff. He's turned water into wine, and there's been a big buzz about that. But he also performed many other signs at the Passover. And his renown is building, and it's reached the palace, okay, Herod's palace. And this desperate dad has heard about Jesus, and he's decided to go on a quest, a 20-mile trek to find Jesus. And when he finds him, his humility is staggering. And you have to remember, this man is a high-ranking official. These guys didn't run in the same circles as rabbis. Okay, they saw themselves as far superior. This man had so much political clout and power over Jesus. But this guy comes to Jesus and he addresses him as Sir. He says to Jesus, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Okay, come down to Capernaum, because Cana's way up high and Capernaum's way down low. And this very powerful man humbles himself before Jesus and he pleads. And the word that he uses for son here is different. Up to this point in the story, it's just sort of been the standard word for a male child. But here it's much more tender. It's much more heartfelt language. It's not just my son. It's like my little guy. It's like he's saying, "Please, sir, please come. You have to come. Please come with me before my little guy dies." Now, can you imagine like this moment? He's now looking at Jesus. He's made the request. He's looking at Jesus. The hope of this man rests on Jesus. It rests on Jesus having power, but it also rests on Jesus being willing. Going from Cana to Capernaum, that's a long, long ways. He's asking Jesus to drop everything and hike with him 20 miles. That's no small request. And he knows it. And Jesus' response in the story, and I love this about the scriptures, Jesus' response is often so weird. It's just kind of odd and insensitive, his response. The guy asks us, he's pleading for the life of his son, and Jesus says, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe." Aren't you just like, really, Jesus? That's so rude. I mean, okay, but what's happening here is Jesus is talking to like the broader crowd that's there, that's all listening in. People that have come for primarily the wrong reasons. They just want to see miracles. They just want to see signs. They just want to be entertained. And so Jesus addresses them through this man. But then he says, go, your son will live. He's saying, I actually don't need to go with you. I can heal your son from right here. My power isn't limited to space. I can do whatever I want from wherever I want. And just so you know, I'm willing to heal your son. So go, don't worry anymore. Your son will live. Now, for the man to walk away could either be seen as like great faith or just giving up. But we're told by John that it was the former. It was incredible faith. We're told that the father took Jesus at his word, and so he left and he headed for home. On the way, he's met by his servants with great news. His son had made a recovery. And when they talked about the timing of it, it was the exact time he realized that he had had this conversation with Jesus. So this man has gone on an all-out quest for Jesus. And this was no small expedition. And that's kind of the thing about pursuing Jesus. Sometimes it's a long journey. Sometimes it costs us something. Many people are willing to follow Jesus, like up to the point of inconvenience. Like more than willing to follow Jesus as long as it's all easy. But if there's a lesson we can learn from this royal official, it's this. If you want to experience a miracle, sometimes you have to go out of your way. Now, I want to come back to you and me. For those of you that have come to the end of yourselves in some way, my question would be this. Have you pursued Jesus relentlessly? Like, have you really? Have you tried everything you know? Like, maybe you've tried everything you know, and maybe you've utilized every resource that you have. But have you pursued Jesus with reckless abandon? Have you been willing to go way out of your way? Have you humbled yourself and begged and pleaded? Now, Jesus certainly doesn't answer every prayer, and he has his reasons. And I don't pretend in the slightest to know what they are. I don't know why some prayers are answered over others, but I do know this. We won't know what he'll do unless we ask. And far too often, as I just look at my own life, far too often I try to do it all on my own. Far too often I look only to the resources that I happen to have at my disposal. And when those resources come up short, far too often I just resign myself. I just give up, just throw in the towel. Now, that hasn't always been true. There have been a few times when that's not been the case. I have at times, and this will be reassuring to you coming from your pastor, I have at times actually pursued Jesus. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In the early years for me of checking out Christianity, I didn't become a Christ follower until I was 20 years old. And in the early years of checking out Christianity, there were things about it that were kind of compelling to me. But at the same time, I had so much doubt. It sort of felt like, I don't know if I'll ever know. I don't know that I can ever really land on this. But something occurred to me. I thought to myself, okay, if this does happen to be real, if God is God and Jesus is his son, then he might be able to help me with this. In fact, he might want to help me with this. It's actually possible, if this is true and it's real, that this could get resolved. So for about 2 years, I went on this journey. I read everything that I could get my hands on that dealt with the questions that I had. I talked to Christians that I respected. I went to church regularly and listened and tried to take it all in. But also, and this is kind of interesting, even though I didn't believe fully, I prayed. And it was one of those just kind of, God, if you're real, help me with my faith. Help me see you and love you and give myself to you. Just kind of, God, I am begging you, if this is legit, please help me to trust it. Now, it took a long time, and it was no small journey, but after a few years of relentlessly pursuing Jesus, something changed for me. And I can't really explain it, but something changed for me, and my shaky faith became strong. I saw things that I didn't see before. I understood things I didn't understand before. I felt things I had never felt before. And I'll tell you what, that whole experience has led me to places that I never imagined that I would go, like standing right here. But had I resigned myself to this place of, I guess I'll just never know, I honestly have no idea where things would be for me. Okay, another arena where I've seen this play out is in my marriage. Now, I don't know any nice way to say this, but the first year of my marriage was like hell at times. I mean, Jen and I just couldn't seem to get on the same page. I felt like she was disappointed in me all the time, like she was mad at me all the time, and so I was mad that she was mad, because I was like, look, I am quite a catch. If you haven't noticed, I'm a stud. And so I know how to get along with everyone, and I've never had any issues with any of my roommates. I was always a peacemaker with all my friends. Okay, I am pretty much an awesome guy. So if you're having problems with me, you got issues. Like, what's the matter with you? And I tried to do everything that I knew to do. Like all my tricks, all the different strategies that I'd always use to make everybody happy, and nothing was working. Because it turns out I was selfish, and she knew it. And she called me on it, and I resented her for it. And besides that, we had all of these other misunderstandings. Like, we just weren't communicating well. We would just explode, and then we'd isolate, and like I'd be at home in our apartment, and just feeling totally uneasy all the time, because I don't know if you've ever been married and had these seasons, like there was nowhere to go to get away from the tension. And I remember night after night going to bed alone, okay, which is not what I dreamed about before we got married. But I'd go to bed alone because we're fighting again. And I would just lay there mad, like stewing. And then finally I'd be like, I should pray. And so I would. I'd be like, God, help us. Help me to learn to love her. Help me become the husband that you want me to be. Like, help us get on the same page. Help us to figure out what's happening, why this keeps happening. God, please help. Like, I am completely at the end of myself. And so I prayed that prayer 11 months and 23 days after we got married, and that night everything changed, and it's been like a fairy tale ever since. Actually, that's not how it went at all. Like, it was a slow go. Things didn't resolve overnight. I will say praying always seemed to help. For some reason, I could see my own faults a lot better when I prayed. And then I could go and ask for forgiveness. And I've learned that things, like in my house, things usually go better when I do that. But over the years, as I've continued to pray, and as Jen has continued to pray, our marriage has been utterly transformed. And I will tell you that that chick has become absolutely my best friend in the whole world. There is nobody that I would rather be with than her, and I love you all. There's nobody that I would rather be with than her. And our home is no longer a battlefield. I mean, it truly feels like a home. And I'm just going to give you my take on the whole thing. I think our relentless pursuit of Jesus has resulted in a miracle. I think he's answered our prayers and then some. But guys, this has taken years and years and years of praying. We've had to walk all the way to Cana and back. And so here's my question for you. If you've come to the end of yourself in some way, are you willing to walk to Cana? Are you willing to pursue Jesus relentlessly? Okay? To not just give up, to not just throw in the towel. Our story today is about a guy who went out of his way to meet Jesus. He did. And Jesus moved. And that takes us to the conclusion of this story. Number 3, the activity of Jesus leads to faith. We're told that when the father realized his son had been healed, and when he realized it was the exact time that he had been talking with Jesus, we're told that he and his whole household believed. Okay, so the problem led to a pursuit. The pursuit led to a miracle, and the miracle led to faith. And faith, or the word believe here, is not the idea that this man suddenly was inspired like for the afternoon. The idea here is that this event forever changed his relationship with Jesus. He became a believer. Now, he had limited information about Jesus at that time. Okay, this was before the cross. This was before the resurrection. The information available to him was really pretty limited, but there was absolutely no limit to his love for Jesus. He gave Jesus his whole heart. For the rest of his life, that moment in Cana was a turning point. The man who had political power over Jesus humbled himself. He made a request, and Jesus responded, and he never forgot. He would go back time and again to that moment in Cana. And I just want to close by addressing those of you that have walked with Jesus. Those of you that have met with Jesus, and you know you've seen him move. At one time, you were in a crisis, and you were at the end of yourself. Now, maybe you're single, and you didn't want to be, and you asked Jesus to move. Or you were depressed, and you asked Jesus to move. Or you had no child, and you asked Jesus to move. You had no job, you asked Jesus to move. Your faith was falling apart, and you asked Jesus to move. Or you were lonely, and you were struggling, and you asked Jesus to move. And he did. He did in one of those arenas, in some other arena. He did. And now you're living in a new reality. But it's easy to take where we are for granted. To forget that where we are is actually a miracle, that it's an answer to prayer. And when we forget the faithfulness of God, we lose faith. And that's why we need to go back to the miracles that God has already done in our lives. We need to go back to them over and over. When you lose your way, or you lose your faith, or when you come to the end of yourself yet again, you need to go back to the Canas of your life. You need to go back to the hospital, or back to the day that you met your spouse, or back to the period that you prayed for God to give you a child, and then you got that report, or you knew that you were pregnant. Or you go back to the day that you got the job, or you go back to the day that God broke through your doubt and something real started to happen in you. You need to go back to Cana. Let what he's already done remind you of what he can do. And then once again, be willing to pursue him relentlessly. Because guys, just because you journeyed once doesn't mean that your journey's over. There may be a new journey for you. Are you willing to go on one again?